This week on Life and Faith.
He writes in that essay, I don't write for children. I write for the childlike, whether of 5 or 50 or 75. What he means to say is that his stories are going to resonate with people who have these kind of childlike qualities, this openness, this imagination, this wonder.
It's really infuriating because 10% of pregnancies are not normal.
I was giving up on this whole thing of faith.
Within a year, all of the wedding china was smashed.
Life is not made of straight lines.
Change the paradigm.
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Max Jigganathan.
Today we're going to be talking about children's literature and we'll have an expert to join us for that. But before we get into that, Max, I wanted to ask you, what were some of your favourite stories as a child?
So much could be said here, Simon, but I certainly remember the Chronicles of Narnia coming up big when I was growing up. I also remember my mum specifically reading me Dickens's Oliver Twist a number of times. And then on top of that, probably the Harry McClary books and Beatrix Potter, anything with Peter Rabbit and his universe. And then more recently, since I've started reading to my kids, I'll probably add to that the Dr. Seuss books as well.
Yes, me too. Dr. Seuss was great. The Hardy Boys, don't know if you ever came across them.
Oh, yep.
Probably a bit before your time, Max.
Slightly.
But I must admit, when we started to think about this episode, I was mostly thinking about the stories I read to my kids when they were young.
Right.
And they are very precious to me. And I know you've had this experience too, Max, where you're rediscovering, kids' books when you have little kids and finding new wonderful ones. I loved, and I would challenge anyone to read to a child Nobody Owns the Moon and not get a lump in your throat.
Wow.
It's a beautiful story, as are many of them. I loved Harry McClary too.
Yep.
Books like Let's Get a Pup. There's one about the beach. Is it just called The Beach?
Yeah,
got that?
Alison Lester. That's
Great,
a big one.
Sort of Australian, very classical kind of Australian
that's
story.
Still doing the rounds.
And as they got a bit older, anything by Frank Cottrell Boyce. Cosmic, the story Cosmic by him is absolutely brilliant.
Right.
And like you, Roald Dahl, I loved reading that to the kids. It's sort of subversive.
Yeah.
It's kind of a bit naughty, but hilariously funny for the kids and the adults.
A lot of great stuff there.
So joining us today is Dr. Amanda B Vernon. She's a children's literature scholar. She's from America, got a PhD in the UK, and has focused, among many other things, but focused on Victorian children's literature. That, of course, refers to books and stories that were written while Queen Victoria was on the throne, 1837 to the turn of the century, 1901. Now, Max, you got to have this conversation with Amanda.
Yeah, I did. Now, one of the reasons Amanda is uniquely interesting in talking about children's literature is that she's what they call an interdisciplinary scholar. So she looks at children's literature not just as a literary expert, but also through the lenses of theology, psychology, philosophy, music, and various other things, which offers fascinating insights that apply to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not complicating things too much, is it, Max?
No, I don't think so. Not at all.
Now, it sounds like a great conversation. This is a topic I'm very interested in. I'm looking forward to hearing this one.
Yeah, it was a fascinating and an interesting conversation. So, I really enjoyed it. I thought it made sense to begin by asking Amanda how she first became interested in children's literature.
Well, I guess I never really stopped being interested in children's literature. I think that would probably be the most accurate way of phrasing it. I was a kind of classic bookworm when I was a kid, and then just never really stopped reading children's books. I guess because I've always enjoyed the creativity, the imaginative expansion that you find in children's books.
Right.
They can be cozy and comforting, but I think they can also deal with some really big kind of adult level or even cosmic issues in a way that I found, as I've gotten older, to be very fresh and constructive and often cutting right to the heart of things. Kids don't, wait around for, to unpack things too long. So I think there's a real freshness to that. So I enjoy reading them personally. And then I guess I became interested in a more academic perspective on children's books, researching children's books during my undergraduate degree. So I gravitate towards Victorian literature. That's what I work on now. And I wanted to write my dissertation on Alice in Wonderland in part. So I started with that.
Right.
And I kind of got into the Victorian children's books and was surprised. I, of course, was drawn to them I guess because I enjoyed them. But the more I dug into people like Lewis Carroll and George MacDonald, the more I was surprised and kind of intrigued by the complexity of what was going on in these books. Not, they're not only fun and kind of quirky, but also really dealing with some complex issues.
So you started off in kids' books as a kid and never got off the horse.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, interesting. I think my journey was probably kind of the opposite. I think I was into it when I was a kid, but it wasn't until I had my own kids that I'm now fully back into it again.
Yeah.
So for someone that's been kind of so immersed in it for so long, this next question is going to infuriate you, so feel free to just choose one. But do you have a favourite children's book? Or did you have one growing up, and why was it your favourite?
Yeah, that is a really difficult question. I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to give you I think I have an entire shelf still at my parents' house with, paperback covers falling off of the Brian Jakes, the Redwall or the Mossflower books, which are about little kind of medieval fighting mice and things.
Okay.
I definitely reread those a lot, but I think if I had to pick one, it would be A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett, which is kind of a classic children's book. But I reread that one so many times, and I think that probably did the most to shape me as a child. It's one of the ones that kind of lives in my memory. I think I entered into that world.
What do you think it was about that? Is there anything you could put your finger on that really hit home with you? Or is it just a general uplift and immersion in it that you remember?
Yeah, I think kind of true to form, I'm very consistent. It's set in the Victorian period, so I think I think I always liked that from when I was a kid. I was always interested in that period. There's kind of foggy London and gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages and things. But I think the story really, stories are, if a good story is about a lot of things, so I hesitate to use the language of this is a story about X, because it's usually a story about X, Y, and Z. But I think for me that A Little Princess is a story about the power of imagination, and it's about Sarah Crew's survival through her imagination. So, she survives being sent to boarding school and having her father leave. Her mother's dead, and then her father dies while she's at boarding school, and then so she's kind of abused and hungry and cold and has to work, as a child. She's essentially made to move from being a student to a servant living in the attic who isn't treated well. And she survives that through her imagination. She survives it by creating this kind of imaginative reality for herself that gives her courage and enables her to keep treating people with kindness and, grace. Yes. And then ultimately, as in most good children's books, she's vindicated. So she, kind of justice comes to the baddies, and she's okay at the end. So I think probably there's something that I think that appealed to me, I think. And it's funny, because you read things as a kid and you just read them because you like them.
Right.
And then you go back, and when I reread it as an adult, I was surprised. I was surprised at how I recognized how much I had inhabited that as a child. And I thought, I had no idea that this was in here. I had no idea that this reminds me of how I used to think when I was a kid, kind of trying to imagine myself a certain way. So I don't know if I was drawn to it because of I liked what was in the book or if the book shaped me. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it could well be a little bit of both, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, you talked about, you unpacked helpfully there just one of your favourites. You also mentioned, though, at the beginning, talking mice and other things. I think that's a good opportunity just to clarify for our listeners, because there are often distinctions made between classical fairy tales like The Ugly Duckling or Cinderella and fantasy, if you like The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. But just to clarify, the phrase children's literature really, in a sense, can take in all of this, right? It's really just about fiction written with children in mind that can take various forms. Is that how you'd define children's literature?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I think a lot of children's writers for children or children's book writers hesitate to call themselves children's book writers or to talk about the books that they write as being specifically for children. A lot of my favorites, anyway, have always kind of talked about it as being a broader thing. So I think it's helpful to categorize it in terms of books that are maybe deal with certain topics in a certain way, and maybe have child protagonists sometimes. And obviously you can find them in the children's section of the bookshop when you go in.
Of course. And some of the great, examples of children's literature in history, especially things written by, people like Mark Twain and Charles Dickens, they're very layered, aren't they? Like they appeal heavily to children, but they can just as easily and perhaps even more commonly be read by adults.
Yes, exactly. And I think those are the best kinds. Those are the ones that last. And I think that's probably why I've continued to read them. But I think you're right in what constitutes children's literature can go from old fairy tales that weren't originally written for children, like the ones you mentioned, the Grimm's brothers or Hans Christian Andersen, the Cinderella, the things that have been passed down to us over generations and pop up in different cultures in different ways that now we kind of tend to think of as children's stories, but they weren't necessarily originally. Which is often, I think, why they can be a little bit violent. We're surprised by that. And children's, books like A Little Princess or the Harry Potter books maybe Harry Potter's that kind of grows a little bit, it can get a little bit older.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Well, I guess on that, just to draw that out a bit more then, in his Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis famously wrote, "One day you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again." What do you think he meant by that?
Oh, I love that. I love that quotation. C.S. Lewis had a real respect for children. He's one of these writers, I think, that I was thinking of actually when I said some writers kind of push back against being like a children's writer, writing children's books. So he did not patronize children. He treated them with as much respect in his writing. And from what I understand from reading about him and reading some of his letters to children, he treated them with as much respect as any adult. And I think the same thing can be said about his attitude towards children's books. So he didn't see children's books as, books for kids. He saw them as a particular literary form that could do what he wanted it, the kind of ideas that he was interested in writing about. So he has this essay on 3 ways of writing for children. It's the title of it. And in that essay, he compares writing children's books to a composer choosing a particular musical form, not necessarily because of the occasion that the composer is writing for or even, a commission for a particular person, but because there are certain musical ideas that the composer wants to explore.
Right.
So it's about the kind of form, and there's nothing to outgrow. It's just as reasonable and valid for an adult to read a children's book, a quote-unquote children's book, as it is for a child. So I think the idea of being old enough to read children's books, again, comes from this idea that, we've grown into maturity. We aren't still in that adolescent phase where we're worried about being childish or looking like we're babies because we're reading something that's supposed to be for kids.
Right. So it's just as much about, the human condition, really, these ideas that he and other great quote-unquote children's writers have been exploring. They're human issues. They're not just kids' issues.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I really liked this image that he uses to talk about this because he talks about the idea of growth and moving from a children's book, moving from a fairy tale to, Jane Austen or Leo Tolstoy or something like that isn't growth, it's change. So he kind of uses the example of a tree, and he says a tree kind of accumulates rings when it grows. It maintains what it has. It continues to add on, unlike a train that moves from one station to another. So a train isn't growing, it's just moving. So he says, you can keep fairy tales and add Tolstoy and Austen, and there's a kind of growth there. And as an adult, you can read your fairy tales and find lots in them. He said, but that's not the point. The point is that all of it is a kind of valid reflection on life, like you're saying, human questions, without jettisoning the fairy tales. I love that idea, of course.
Yeah, so he really, displaces and seeks to replace the idea of progression and graduation with enrichment and thickening and deepening in that sense.
Yes, that is an excellent way of articulating it, absolutely.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and we're hearing Max Jagannathan's interview with literary scholar Amanda Vernon about the joy and hidden wisdom of children's literature. Max asked Amanda for a couple of examples of stories, perhaps written with children in mind, but that speak more deeply to the human condition.
Probably one of the most famous is Alice in Wonderland. So it's a very kind of groundbreaking children's book for a number of reasons. So, as I mentioned, fairy tales weren't always for children. They were for everybody, kind of like folk tales probably is a better way of thinking about it. But in terms of books that were written for children, a lot of them were pretty heavy-handed. They were didactic. They were intended to teach you something, morals or good breeding or whatever it might be. But as we move into the Victorian period with books by people like Lewis Carroll or George MacDonald, and then into the Edwardian period with books, Peter Pan or The Wind in the Willows, those kinds of things, the kind of golden age of children's literature. We have these child characters who have a bit more personality, a bit more agency. It's less about, children should be seen and not heard, and much more about these are the characters that take center stage. And I think Alice is a really good example of a child with agency. So she's very much a child. She's always asking questions. She tumbles into Wonderland and she's looking around at all of these strange creatures and these interactions that she's having. And, that famous phrase, curiouser and curiouser, that she always says. Right. Which is, her kind of thinking, this is very odd, but also reflective of her as a child asking questions and trying to figure out this world that she's found herself in. And she's always changing size as well. She's drinking these little potions and she's eating these little cakes, and they make her big and small. And kids go through a lot of physical changes. They have a growth spurt and they suddenly feel like Alice, who's just, grown to 10 feet high. So that as well is just reflective, I think, of her confusion as she keeps changing physically, as she's encountering these different odd creatures and the logic of Wonderland she's trying to figure out. She's trying to make sense of these strange rules that are being, told to her, which I think is very much like children thinking, well, why do I have to do that? Why does the world work like this,
Right. And it speaks to, the adult reader as much as the child too.
Yes.
Because it seems to reflect so much of lived reality. There's so much wisdom layered into a story like Alice in Wonderland because to some degree the experience of life is things out of your control happening to you.
Absolutely.
But there's also this enormous thrust of agency and responsibility that she's empowered and her decisions matter.
Yes, absolutely. And they do. I mean, she's very much a strong character in that story as she's kind of trying to find some stability. And I think it's an interesting thing because in a lot of most children's books probably, so Alice obviously doesn't have any parental figures around because she's kind of tumbled into this other world. But often in children's books, the main characters are orphans or they have absent parents in some form. So
a lot of that in Charles Dickens and things like that, isn't there?
Yeah. Child narrators, David Copperfield and Oliver Twist and Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Also, I love her. Looking back, she gives Jane a very real human complex personality, and she's looking back at her young self. But so it's interesting. It's interesting how children end up taking the main stage, and I think that really, obviously, that appeals to kids because they're, at least when I was a child, that's what you want to feel like you have some agency. Your parents are always telling you what to do, right?
Yes.
So you kind of want to feel like you can do something. But one of my favorite books where I think this is done so brilliantly is Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time, and I love the book for a lot of reasons, but one reason is that Meg, who's the main character in the story, so her dad is missing. He's a scientist and they don't know where he's gone. He's disappeared. So she goes off to try and rescue him, to find him and to rescue him. And her little brother is also kind of taken over by the bad guy. And what Meg learns on this journey is that her greatest weakness, which is her temper, is also her greatest strength. And I think that's so true, two sides of the same coin. So Meg's anger, which can flare up into temper and always is getting her into trouble at school or getting into fights with other kids. In the context of this kind of going off to rescue her father, she finds herself in this huge cosmic battle. And her anger is actually what ends up being the fuel that she needs to stand up against the evil that she finds. And this kind of righteous anger that she expresses comes from her sense of justice being violated and her love for her little brother and her father. And I think one of the most brilliant things about this series by L'Engle, so it's 5, is the Time Quintet, and A Wrinkle in Time is the book in the series, but she connects the kind of everyday actions of her characters, and especially their choices to love people who they don't like. That's very big in her books, with this kind of huge cosmic battle of spiritual light and darkness. So if you're reading the book, and I think especially if you're reading it as a kid, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, what if what I do matters? What if my little choices, I have very little agency here, but like, what if my little choices and my small actions to show love or kindness or generosity or whatever to someone is actually this huge, powerful weapon against something destructive? What if my little actions are kind of, grassroots resistance, and suddenly we're given this huge vision of what it might actually mean to take these, at times really boring, mundane, hard actions to just, kind of be nice to the person who's annoying you and that kind of thing. Like in the second book, she has to be nice to her principal. She has to love her principal, who's she's always ending up in his office at school because she, and he, they just don't get each other. And so that's kind of her big epic thing that Meg has to do in the second book, is to love the principal of her school, who she just,
so these big, abstract themes of morality and light and darkness then have to still land in everyday life.
Yes, exactly. And I just think it's so brilliant because it kind of invests. Most of us are not going to get to do anything terribly exciting, and kids are always probably dreaming of being a basketball hero or a superhero, whatever it might be. And that's probably not, it might not happen. I don't know. But at the very least, it kind of, I think it invests some excitement and some meaning into the daily activities. I think that kind of imaginative vision, it's a little bit like my experience with Sarah Crew in A Little Princess, it kind of gives you a way of thinking about what you're doing that is more exciting and more interesting.
Yeah. A lot of these kind of layers and themes that you've been talking about are very rich and very heavy and very deep in many ways.
Yes.
One that is in a lot of great children's literature is the idea of good and evil, the darkness, adversity, suffering, some of these tougher things. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that plays into good, resonant children's literature and how it's often dealt with?
There's a historian who works on fairy tales and myth and symbols and things like that. Her name is Marina Warner. And she writes that fairy tales evoke every kind of violence, injustice, and mischance. But in order to declare, it need not continue. So I think we certainly have that kind, all of these things in fairy tales. And I would say the same in a lot of children's books. Fairy tales can be quite, maybe even more violent in some ways, depending. The Grimm's brothers' stories can be quite grim. But fairy tales are kind of in the business of demonstrating the possibility of agency and of justice. So I think that's a really hopeful thing. I think young people and grown-ups need that, especially right now with so much going on in the world. So it's not that kids need to be sheltered, I guess, from dark or scary things, conflict or, threats of death even. They need to know that they can do something about it. They need to know that they can survive it. So even if it is, and a lot of children's books do deal with death, whether it's, the death of an animal like a dog, or whether it's something as serious and as weighty as the death of a friend or of a parent.
Right.
But they need to know that that's survivable, because it does happen. And I think books like, there's a series called The Penderwicks, Jeannie Birdsall's Penderwick series, where there's some kind of real conflict. The mother dies. There's some real conflict between the sisters relationally, but they're just, they're lovely books, but they're also really real. And then you've got these kind of big epic, the Harry Potter series. This is really much more of a kind of good and evil type of thing. But I think kids need these stories where young people like themselves are faced with difficulties and they come out okay, with a struggle. But I think that can lead to resilience. I think it can, again, these imaginative patterns can kind of give a bit of a blueprint for what is possible, I think.
Yeah, and it seems that narrative arc of darkness and evil being dealt with and overcome has stood the test of time. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, in his recent book, The Anxious Generation, he talks about how perhaps we overprotect our kids in the real physical world and we underprotect them in the virtual online world. But maybe one missing piece that, his book wasn't about, but we've never seemed to have protected them too much in the fictional literary world, and that's been a good thing. Perhaps it's actually doesn't try and shade them from the reality of the world in which we're in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think there's a balance with all this, because I was recently reading an article about Catherine Murdoch, whose daughter apparently told her she was feeling very hopeless about the future and thought the future looked really bleak. And her daughter said, well, look at all the, the YA books that are about dystopia. Look at the TV shows and the films. Everything about the future is dystopian. And for Murdoch, that was a bit of a wake-up call, like, oh gosh, like what kind of imaginative world are our teens inhabiting? But I think it kind of illustrates the need that exists as you say, to offer, not to shy away from darkness in stories, but to show a way through the difficulty, or to show that, that their actions matter, that there's some hope there. And I mean, I like a good dystopian, whatever. But again, the kind of balance of finding something that is not going to just kind of depress everybody, especially when you're a young person, because they have to deal with so much. I think they need those tools and resources.
Now, a part of your expertise centres around the Scottish author, whom you've mentioned a couple of times, George MacDonald, who wrote prolifically, including a lot of children's literature. As I understand it now, this year is the 200th anniversary of his birth, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk about him. I know you get excited about George MacDonald. So could you please tell us a little about him? A lot of our listeners might not have heard of him. Can you tell us a little bit about him and how he and his work relates to some of what we've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about MacDonald. You might have to stop me if I keep going too long.
Sure.
He was one of these, Victorian polymaths. So he knew a million languages, and I think he actually knew like 6 or 7. But he knew a lot of languages, and he wrote lots, of incredible work. He wrote essays. He was a literary scholar. He wrote realist novels, theology. He was trained as a Congregationalist minister, and I think he's most famous probably for his fairy tales. He wrote adult fantasy, and then he wrote children's fairy tales and novels. Right. So he's a very theological writer. He's very interested in the spiritual life, and in particular, the idea of childlikeness, which for him is a kind of spiritual term. So he unpacks this in some of his theological writings, but I guess the point of it is that childlikeness for him is associated with characteristics like humility, wonder, openness, playfulness, imagination, these kinds of things. And so he kind of envisions God in this way, and he captures something of what MacDonald saw as this subversion of normative power dynamics. So this idea that kind of might is right and coercion wins the day, that kind of thing, because of his belief that Christ came as a child and kind of privileged children in his, let the little children come to me kind of thing. Right. And so when he talks about childlikeness as a kind of divine characteristic, he's not talking about he makes a distinction between that and a kind of childishness, which is the kind of bullying or petulance or, those kinds of things.
It's more about wonder and imagination and the impossible becoming possible, right?
Yes, exactly. So that's a really big theme for him. So he wrote this wonderful essay called The Fantastic Imagination, which is about him theorizing about fairy stories and what a good fairy story does. Right. And for him, a good fairy story evokes something in us. So it kind of makes us feel something, it awakens something in us and stirs it up in order to kind of get us to think. And he writes in that essay, I don't write for children. He's another one that doesn't write for children. I don't write for children. I write for the childlike, whether of 5 or 50 or 75. And he's not, what he means by this is not, I'm writing for the young at heart. To some extent that's true. But I think what he means to say is that his stories are going to resonate with people who have these kind of childlike qualities, this openness, this imagination, this wonder.
And very much echoes of the C.S. Lewis quote that people get old enough to read fairy tales again. That's
absolutely.
Why we should never really stop.
Yes, and I think, and for MacDonald, that is a huge, our life is a kind of classroom, as if you will, and we're not maturing into, grown-upness. We're maturing into childlikeness. That's kind of the point.
Yes, it's a beautiful thing.
I think C.S. Lewis probably picked some of that up from MacDonald. I think he really liked him. So I would encourage all to go and read some MacDonald because he's wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. Well, on that note, for listeners out there who may be like I was and have made the mistake of perhaps moving on in their reading from their younger years, but who might, after listening to this podcast episode, be old enough now to start reading fairy tales again, do you have a couple of suggestions, obviously including George MacDonald, for books or authors to help get people started or restarted in children's literature, to rediscover that childlikeness?
Yes, of course. Yes. So obviously I'm going to say MacDonald. And where I would start with him is maybe The Light Princess, which is one of his a little bit shorter fairy tales. It's a kind of a satire, a kind of a spoof of Sleeping Beauty. It's very funny and also very deep. So maybe start there or with The Golden Key, which is less funny, but very deep and kind of mystical, and has recently been released as a graphic novel by Stephen Hesselman. It's a really beautiful graphic novel. So if you kind of are more into that, give that a try because it's a really lovely book. The kind of old fairy tales I think are so worth going back and reading because there is so much in them. There's so much depth. So personally, I really like Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales like The Nightingale and The Steadfast Tin Soldier. For those who have a Frozen fan in the house, you could read The Snow Queen, which is different from Frozen. And then some other, kind of Victorian fairy tales like John Ruskin's The King of the Golden River, or Oscar Wilde wrote some beautiful fairy tales. I think my favorite of his is The Selfish Giant. So those are just lovely and really, again, lots of layers of meaning. And if you have not read Winnie the Pooh since you were a child, do yourself a favor and read Winnie the Pooh because it is so funny and very clever, and I would highly recommend it. I think you'll recognize probably a lot of people you know in the character.
Yes, you will.
I guess if I haven't convinced you to go read children's books, then I have one thing for you to read that is not a children's book, but it is by a children's book writer called Catherine Rundle, who writes wonderful, wonderful children's books. And it's like a little essay. It's kind of a manifesto, and it's called Why You Should Read Children's Books Even Though You Are So Old and Wise. And she touches on some of the themes we've discussed, but she kind of expands it a bit more. So you can get that in book form. So I would give that a try and see if that convinces you.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Max Jagannathan.
And a thank you to Amanda Vernon for such an insightful and interesting conversation. Amanda is working on a book on the work of George MacDonald to be published by Manchester University Press. If you're interested, you can find out more on her website and about her other work too in the show notes.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share it with someone else who might like it and leave us a rating or review. It helps more people discover Life and Faith. We'll be taking a short break from Life and Faith for a few weeks, and we'll be back soon with another season. Thanks to our producer again today, the mercurial Alan Douthwaite.